We're seeing it with Trump, but we've seen it in Hungary with Orban. We've seen it in Brazil with Bolsonaro. We've seen this in Poland with Kaczynski, in India with Modi, and on and on and on. They are now part of the political reality in all of these countries. They're not going away.
This is The Rip Current. I'm Jake Ward. We look at the big invisible forces that have us in their grasp. And this week, we're talking about the invisible force of populism. That's the big, boring academic term for this weird moment we're in where the politics of the day seems to be going towards people who argue that they are representing the people, that they're going to take away power from the corrupt elites and give it back to the people. Well, back in 2018, I met a guy who was looking at that in a much bigger way than the rest of us. While the rest of us were reeling about Trump and trying to explain his rise to ourselves, he was looking beyond Trump to the rest of the world and saying, you know what, this is actually happening everywhere. And this isn't just individual little pockets of things. This is a wave of populism coming at us. He was identifying this trend in Europe and Asia, all over the world. And his research has shown that it really seems to play on people wherever they're from. In almost any culture, this kind of rhetoric can work when there are specific sorts of circumstances in play. The guy I'm talking about here is Bart Bonikowski. He's a professor of politics and sociology at NYU. I did a fellowship with him, is how I got to know him. And he is, I think, a fascinating person to talk to about the weird moment we are in politically and why it's not just Trump. It is a bigger thing going on in the world. It's gone on throughout history, and there might even be a way out of it. We get to that at the very end of this. But I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Bart because he gives us, I think, a sense of really why this is happening. And that diagnosis hopefully can lead us to some sort of solution. All right, I want to start here with an anecdote that you won't remember. You and I were fellows together at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at CASBS at Stanford. First fellowship for me. You were much more comfortable with in that environment than I was, but we had to give a presentation of our work. And I remember in your presentation, you were giving, this is 2018 to 2019 academic year. So Trump's in office, and you gave this presentation on sort of the rise of populism broadly. But I remember afterwards saying to you, man, that hair slide was amazing. I don't know if you remember this at all. And you were like, what hair slide? And we went back and looked together, and there was a slide where it was Trump, Boris Johnson, what's his name from Hungary? Like all these
Orban.
guys Orban, who all had this weird peroxide hair flip, or whatever. Like they just all had this sort of funny fake blonde hair. And it was a really interesting thing because it jived with a thing that you said in the course of that presentation, which is that it all looks like a sort of conspiracy. And there may be a little bit of those guys sharing, best practices. But mostly you're at the time you were sort of describing them as just people who threw spaghetti against the wall and the same spaghetti stuck. And that's why they sort of were in such lockstep. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you, does it feel to you now like it's still spaghetti at the wall? Or are we getting into a world, I mean, you study this stuff for a living. Are we getting into a world where they really are getting organized in a deeper way than you were thinking about at that time?
I think we're in the post spaghetti stage. So there are two possible ways to answer that question, or to think about the coordination across different countries in this respect. So it could be that they're all meeting and actively exchanging ideas, or there could be the possibility that they're looking to each other from a distance and mimicking one another, seeing what works.
That works. Well, that went well for him. Exactly. I'll do that one.
And I think actually both are happening, but more of the latter than the former. So I think there's a lot of learning happening across countries where, exactly as you just pointed out, they see what works, they adapt it to their own local setting, and deploy it typically effectively to garner support and mobilize votes for their political projects. So I think that's the bulk of it. But there is also direct interaction as well. So Nigel Farage touring the United States.
Right. CPAC goes to Hungary.
Exactly. Narendra Modi coming to the US or vice versa. Bannon going around the world and trying to be kind of the consultant to the radical right worldwide. Yeah. So there is that for sure. And some people refer to that as the populist international or whatever it may be. but I think although that is happening, it is neither necessary nor probably that important. I think the bulk of the learning happens from afar.
Hmm.
And the process of mimicry, of what some academics might call isomorphism, is really about adapting the playbook to the
Hmm.
local context. Similar mechanisms of mobilization, similar ways of fomenting grievance, bundling the grievances, and translating them into a particular set of political outcomes, but with very different content in each country, right? And I think,
Right.
one contrast is if you compare India, let's say, with the United States, the vilified group is different. Obviously, in India, it's
Hmm.
Hindus who are vilifying Muslims.
Yeah.
In the United States, although there's plenty of Islamophobia, especially in the current moment, that's salient. But it's more about immigration writ large,
Yeah.
let's say,
Right.
right? Mexican
Right.
immigration and so forth. So the content varies, but the mechanisms and the processes through which radical right politics gain support are quite similar.
Right. So I was going back and looking at like early work that you did. So you're like 2010 dissertation at Princeton, and the this young innocent Bart Bonikowski looking at you know what makes people what do people think about their own sort of American identity? Like
Yeah.
you were looking at sort of nationalism and just as like what makes people American, or think that they're American, kind of. And then clearly, right, something changes when Trump takes office. I mean, I remember for me when Trump took office. So I was doing this documentary series on PBS called Hacking Your Mind. And we thought we were documenting, it was all about like how people, make decisions in this kind of automatic and manipulable way. And then Trump takes office, and we thought up until that point that we were doing this kind of like, man, look what we almost fell into. But
Hmm.
then Hillary won was kind of what we thought the framing of this documentary was going to be. And then Trump wins. And we realized, oh my God, we've been documenting exactly why this guy got into office. And you, it feels like, also had like the raw ingredients already of really thinking about this stuff. Do you remember, like, was there a pivotal moment for you? Like, I remember being in the Phoenix airport the morning he won and clapping my producer on the shoulder, my two producers on the shoulder, and being like, you guys, we're suddenly doing really important work on this documentary. Like, this is suddenly a bigger deal than I thought, like, and it was a big turning point for me. For my
Right.
producer, I remember his thing was smashing up the bottle of champagne he had saved for election night. He took out the next morning and smashed in his driveway. For you, like, was there a moment where you were like, oh wow, it turns out I thought I was studying this. Turns out I've been studying this all this time.
I think many of us, probably most Americans, remember where they were the night of the election and the morning after. And I have quite visceral memories of both. The night before, I was at a party that turned to be more of a mourning event or than a celebratory event, as many of us felt. And the day after, I was actually in the morning teaching political sociology to undergraduates at Harvard.
Wow.
Students from all walks of life, but many of them already that morning felt a dramatic change in their lives.
Mm.
Many tears. It was a very hard class to teach. I quickly abandoned the curriculum and just focused on talking to the students and actually more listening to the students. They had a lot of things to
Wow.
say. But those are more, those sort of like everybody remembers where they were when JFK
Do you
was
remember,
assassinated.
just out of curiosity,
Yeah.
like what are Harvard undergrads were processing it raw? What do you remember
Well,
from
so
that?
this was a sociology class, and there are all kinds of stereotypes of Harvard undergraduates. In sociology, it was a really diverse group in a variety of ways. Some first generations college students, some students who either had undocumented families or themselves, were maybe had DACA status or, really a diverse group. And so there was a lot of just deep disappointment, fear, just really not knowing what's next, and a sense that nothing would be the same again, right? And
Mm.
in the subsequent class, maybe a week later, I had students telling me that they're walking the streets of Cambridge like they had done for the prior months, and all of a sudden, people are throwing racial slurs at them in a way that they had
Whoa.
not done before. So there's a
Wow.
very kind of phenomenologically, experientially, a very big distinction between the before election and post election
Right.
reality.
The
Even in
culture
a
was changing.
right, yeah, it's sort of the permission structure had changed very rapidly
Yeah.
in a place that's quite a progressive town, a college town, obviously. And the same people on the same streets are now saying things they wouldn't have said a week
Yeah.
before. So there was kind of at the micro level that kind of anxiety, but then of course just the big picture, just a fear of already on the first day, students worrying that major gains in civil rights, racial justice, social justice would be undone. And
Right.
from the perspective of today, going back to that moment, their fears were quite well founded.
Yeah, sure.
Were there, and I think probably in a much worse place than they could have even imagined.
Yeah.
And we can come back to this topic, but the fact that it happened in fits and starts, one term in office, then leaving office, returning to office with a vengeance, is actually a
Mm.
pattern that has played out in numerous places, not just in the United States. And so I
Hmm.
mention this because I think the anticipation at that moment was we're in for a very difficult 4 years,
Hmm.
maybe 8 years, right?
Hmm.
But
Right.
actually, the reality is we were in for a difficult 4 years with a brief breather in between,
Kinda.
followed by kinda, right, yeah,
Right.
maybe,
Right.
followed by what could be another 4 or many, many more years of serious crisis of democracy. And so I
Mm.
think I think at that moment, people knew things would be bad. They didn't know what would how quickly things would happen or how long they would last. And I think
Yeah.
nobody anticipated that it would unfold in this particular way. But I think now in hindsight, and also with the benefit of having studied other cases, other countries, this is actually a frequent pattern that the radical right comes into power, gets kicked out, comes back with a vengeance, having already laid the groundwork for even greater
Wow.
damage. Uh,
That's
but
really interesting. How
but
do
you
we
asked about. Sorry, we can do go in whichever direction
Yeah,
you
no,
want.
I
But I
I
wanted.
wanna ask many things. Well, let me let's tie off this thing. If Bart
Yeah,
Bonikowski had continued down the same academic path he'd been on
right,
and Hillary had won,
right.
like, what would do you remember, like, what you thought you were gonna go on to do at that time? Like, you were gonna be sort of like this kind of, I don't know, like, what were you gonna do in a Clinton history
It's a great
timeline?
question. So I will say I would have probably done something similar because the U.S. wasn't the only case of radical right politics
Oh, right.
emerging at the time. And so the same year we had Brexit, we had the
Yeah,
rise
right.
of Front National in France, et cetera, et cetera. Orban and so forth, Kaczynski in Poland. And so my dissertation that you referenced was really looking at heterogeneity, diversity of understandings of the nation across countries. So the
Hmm.
idea was, it turns out that what America means to Americans is not a single unified, set of concepts, ideas, beliefs. There are actually many Americas that are
Mm.
imagined within the country, and there are deep cleavages within the population in terms of how people understand their country.
Hmm.
And that the
Is
dissertation
that
showed
are the cleavages deeper than they tend to be in other countries? Like, is our sense
no.
of
So that
ourselves
was the
bigger?
punchline from the dissertation, that actually
Hmm.
you see the same kinds of cleavage structures in all contemporary democracies.
Oh,
So
wow.
this is why, and
Huh.
of course, I didn't anticipate where this was going to go politically, but from biographically, from my prior research, I kind of gained this understanding, had this hunch that actually nationalism is deeply divided within countries, pretty much across the world.
Hmm.
I grew up in Poland initially, then spent a good 12 years in Canada, then moved to the United States, and in all places I lived, I saw some variant of this, of
Hmm.
deep disagreements about what the nation means to me, what history of the nation I think is meaningful and important and real for that matter, and,
Right.
and therefore where the nation ought to go. What I didn't know at the time, this was again 2011, is when I got my PhD. I didn't know at the time that this would become so politically weaponized so quickly, but I had a
Hmm.
sense that these differences in understandings of the nation were important. I didn't know exactly how yet. It was sort of, I had inklings, but as we start getting into 2015, 2016, I started realizing that, wow, these Trumpism, radical right movements in the countries really represented one of those variants of national self-understanding, a particularly ethnocentric one, a particularly nativist one, racist one that was really about drawing very sharp boundaries around who gets to belong, who doesn't,
Yeah.
combined with a sense of a nostalgia for a lost nation, where people like us, fill in the blanks,
Right.
were in at the center of the nation. And
Where
so I
America
saw
was
that
once
in
great and no longer.
that's right. That's right.
Right.
Because it used to be ours, meaning
Yeah.
belonging to white, Christian, mostly male Americans, and things have changed radically. And so that same kind of disposition I saw in all the cases I studied. And my dissertation, I think I looked at 30 countries or something. I was using
Hmm.
survey data, and I saw very similar configurations of nationalist beliefs in very different places.
Hmm.
And so, I saw it in Poland, and then, radical right politics took over there in a profound way. I saw it in Hungarian data, same thing.
Hmm.
I saw it in Canada, actually, where this hasn't come to pass, but just by some sheer luck, actually, we
Hmm.
can talk about that. So the point is that the kind of the ground was fertile for this kind of politics in a wide range of countries. And fast forward a few years, we now see radical right politics pretty much everywhere. There are very
Yeah.
few negative cases. There used
Right.
to be, PhD students writing dissertations about, oh, why Sweden won't have a radical right party.
Mm,
A few years later, Sweden has a radical right party. And
right.
the number of countries that have a mainstreamed radical right is just growing by the day. And at this point, is basically nearly every democracy. So that's my work took a turn in the sense that I then started seeing how these nationalist cleavages were being weaponized, how nationalism was combined with populist rhetoric and with authoritarian governance strategies to
Yeah.
essentially challenge the status quo of liberal democracy in very
Mm.
different countries.
And I mean, what you thought maybe was at the time, like, or maybe your, you know, thesis advisors would have said at the time, was like a bunch of different little tide pools that you were comparing, turned out to be one big fucking tide, you know?
Basically.
Like,
And
I
and
mean,
I think this topic seemed kind of esoteric and cute to people. Like, oh, nationalism, how
mm,
interesting. Why should we care? And I'm not sure that I really understood why we should care aside from some sort of a hunch. But I think, yeah, eventually when you realize, wow, we're now, elections are being decided on which America you believe is the real America or a real France in France or a real Poland in Poland or whatever. And where every election feels existential to both sides
mm,
increasingly.
yeah.
It turns out that this stuff is actually incredibly important, more important than I had anticipated at the
So
time.
do you think that the commonality here, I mean, you said it's fertile ground. Is the ground what is the ground? Like, is it psychological? I mean, like you teach sociology. Is it sociological? Like, is it something about human circuitry that people are
Mhm.
learning to play on here? Or like, what do you think? What is the commonality we're seeing here?
I think what we're seeing is a commonality of belief systems. And
Mhm.
I guess the idea is that in every democracy, there's sort of more open, inclusive, progressive trends and tendencies, and more inward-looking, exclusionary ones. I think that's the case in most countries. So these are belief systems, but they're also public narratives, right?
Mhm.
They're also ideologies that politicians use to mobilize support. So it's both attitudes, kind of bottom up level, and it is discursive frames or narratives from the top down. And really, what's happening is in specific historical moments, those beliefs and those rhetorical frames resonate in ways that they
Yeah.
hadn't before. So I think that the kind of structural sociological part of this, the real question is, why are these pre-existing belief structures, belief systems, and to some degree pre-existing discursive frames that elites use in politics, why are they all of a sudden resonating now in this historical moment, but
Mm,
not in the 90s, not in the 80s, right? There's
mm,
certainly attempts, Pat Buchanan and others, right, in the 90s to leverage similar kinds of rhetoric that worked, but didn't work to nearly the same extent as they have in more recent years. And
yeah.
it's not like there was a shortage of racism, anti-immigrant sentiment, et cetera, in the population at the time. So it's something about the newfound resonance between the pre-existing beliefs and pre-existing frames.
Bart, I'm going to say it might rhyme with Shark Muckerberg. That's going to be mine. When we come back, we're going to talk about social media and the way this goes. And we're also going to have Bart go 101 on you so that we all understand the difference between populism, nationalism, and authoritarianism. We'll be right back. So I was watching a video the other day of old WWF wrestling, World Wrestling Federation matches, and it was ridiculous, right? The old stuff from the 90s, right? And it's Madison Square Garden. A camera pans the crowd, and there's a guy leaning out of the crowd with a placard that says something like the president is a lizard and what the White House is an alien spaceship or something, like some crazy piece of conspiracy, right? And I remember thinking, wow, man, that guy had to buy a ticket, right? He had to know when it was coming down. He had to get lucky that it was the one that was the match that was going to get broadcast. He had to get close enough to the stage. So he paid a good price for that ticket. He somehow had to get that sign in there. So he probably like rolled it up and put it in his pants or something. And then he had to get lucky that the camera came across him at that moment. Like, I think people don't remember, like, I worked at Al Jazeera and people vilified Al Jazeera for years for having carried Osama bin Laden's videotape, which we can have a perfectly good faith conversation about. But we have to remember there was no YouTube at that time. So he had to have a broadcaster had to, he had to give it to a broadcaster, and he gave it to Al Jazeera. If he'd given it to somebody else, they would have run it. So I don't know. I just think like we're in such a different information ecosystem. Do you think am I overplaying that, or do you think that's a big difference maker here?
It's a frequent and really difficult question because it's hard to know the answer definitively.
Mm,
It's hard to study this question because
right,
it's hard to know how to measure the effect of social media. And we know there's a ton of research on echo chambers, on social media bubbles, and et cetera. And oddly enough, most of that research is largely inconclusive. A lot of this
right. I
stuff
know,
seems
I know.
overplayed, right? But it's
It makes me
possible that we're
crazy.
asking the wrong questions,
Right,
and it's
right.
it's it's impossible that the speed and the ability to produce content that is part and parcel of social media. It's hard to imagine that doesn't matter. Obviously matters. I wonder. So my best guess, based on things I've read and my own research on this, is that it's an accelerant. It's not a
Mhm.
prime cause, but it's an accelerant.
Right.
The reason I don't think it's a prime cause is that we've had historical moments like this, in without social media. Think about McCarthyism, right? Think about
Mm,
various other moments in American history where the worst sides of us came out
right.
and collectively and led to these moments of illiberalism, heightened illiberalism, let's say. Um, and that all happened in the absence of social media.
Right. I'm
You think
thinking also of like the rise of different fascists.
I was just going to
Right.
say, yeah, think about the
Yeah.
30s, right? I mean,
They
old
weren't, what are they
school,
writing letters? How are they
yeah,
getting
right, right,
coordinated? That's right.
right.
That's
And
right.
so what it doesn't appear to be is a necessary feature
Right.
of the rise of radical right politics. But it's certainly an important ingredient. Another example before I say more about this is Richard Hofstadter had this book, the Paranoid Style in American Politics, written in the
Mm,
'60s.
mm,
Talking about the exact same things we're talking about: the belief in
mm,
conspiracy theories, the fact
mm.
that a good fraction of Americans are willing to believe all kinds of things
Yeah.
about conspiracies in the government, about that many elites are part of. The stuff that we're hearing these days from QAnon is just a different form of things that we've heard for a long
Yeah.
time in American
I,
history. So the way I think of it is that there are other structural reasons why the current moment is one in which illiberal democracy, or maybe even illiberal authoritarianism, is spreading rapidly. But I think social media is an important catalyst accelerant. I
mm,
think the more foundational reasons are probably just rapid social, cultural, economic change that is
mm.
creating all kinds of inchoate anxieties and frustrations in the population, and particularly among groups that tended to think of themselves as really at the core of the nation.
On top.
So in the
Yeah.
United
Right.
States, white Christian men, it's not like these people are necessarily all privileged. That's not the point in a sort of
Right.
material sense, but privilege in terms of status for sure. All of a sudden the world for them changing rapidly. All of a sudden the world becoming more diverse. That all of a sudden rights regimes are expanding. Intergenerational economic mobility slowing down. Immigration is
And
increasing.
yeah, and you would, and I could argue, right, that also while it's not as if they don't have privilege, they don't have the same economic opportunities that they did in the post-war, manufacturing boom, or when Eisenhower limited the price of a new home to 250,000 modern dollars, right? Like these were folks,
Yep.
they did have. I mean, so it's funny. I got to go to Portugal for a very brief trip for the very first time, and I got to go into this crazy museum there that I'd never heard about, called Aljube, that is a political prison for people under the Salazar regime that's been converted into this museum. Totally amazing. And I was such a naive. I didn't know anything about fascism in Portugal. I thought it was all red wine and fun. I knew nothing about Portuguese history, and one of the things that the people there were sort of explaining was that there was this liberal monarchy, basically, this sort of liberal elites kind of realm that had been in charge, and then suddenly devastating economic disaster
Right.
for which those liberal elites had no answer.
Hmm.
And then along comes fascist economics minister Salazar selling a whole thing about how important it is to be Portuguese. And in Portugal, here are the fundamentals of being Portuguese, and women should be in the home, and da da da. and boom, he just,
Yeah,
is like a firework.
of
And I
course.
was like, man, I recognize that. Like,
Right.
that sounds familiar to me.
Right,
That's
and
right.
it's similar with Hitler, right? Post World War One,
Yeah.
crisis in Germany, economic crisis as well, crisis of governance, and so I think it's not reducible to economic factors in the sense that actually you see radical right politics spring up in places where there is no economic crisis, but there I
Mm,
think that what I would argue is that it's a multi-causal story. There are
sure.
all kinds of rapid changes that lead to a sense of displacement anxiety, et cetera, among people who used to be maybe a privileged position to some
S-
degree. And
So
those,
is change the common
I
thread
think
here? Is
so.
that it is? An
I
allergic
think so.
reaction to change?
Yeah, to rapid shocks to the system, or sometimes
Mm,
more aggressive changes that kind of reach a certain apex. And so
mm,
they can be economic. It can be deindustrialization. It could be economic crises. And we've certainly seen a fair share of those. It can be rapid increases in immigration and refugee
yeah.
flows. It can be perceived changes in popular culture, who gets to be at the core of of how we imagine ourselves and how that changes over time. It can be an increase in social movements of all sorts, and I think often it's also the confluence of multiple of these changes all at once. And so in the United States, you have growing inequality, you've got wage stagnation at the bottom, you've got
Yeah.
slowing intergenerational mobility economically, but you also have kind of an expansion of progressive rights regimes, the expansion of rights for people of color, for LGBTQ people, et cetera. At the same time, you've got ongoing immigration, which is an important part of the American fabric. But all of these things together create a sense of threat, potentially,
Yeah. Right.
especially to populations that, again, used to see themselves at the core of the nation. But I think for most part, that sense of threat is sort of, it's inchoate. It's not articulated clearly. It's sort of, things are changing. I'm not loving it. My
Mm,
my community is maybe suffering. I don't know what to do about it. But what happens then is opportunistic politicians come in and bundle those fears together and say, you know what, you should be anxious. You should
brilliant.
be
Mm,
afraid. Actually, all these things are a problem, and they're all the problem because of two factors: corrupt elites who don't care
mm,
about you and don't represent you,
mm,
and the immigrants and minorities that they're in cahoots with. And
mm.
so, if you want to get
Those are the talking points.
yeah, those are the talking points. And if you want your
Mm,
country back, elect me. I'll
mm.
I'll bring you back to the way things were. Now, this may take some extraordinary measures. A little bit of authoritarianism might have to happen, but it's all for a good cause, right?
Yeah,
That's
right.
sort of the rhetoric. And then what happens is that these kind of inchoate anxieties and fears get sort of crystallized into a deep sense of grievance.
Mm,
And in my work, I argue that actually activates these nationalist beliefs that were pre-existing but had been
mm,
largely latent. So all of a
mm,
sudden, people are voting on their nationalist beliefs, not on other considerations. And just one example of this in the United States: why would it be the case that, let's say, in the 70s, 80s, fewer people who might hold exclusionary nationalist beliefs are not voting on them? Well, A, things are not going as poorly for them as they are maybe recently. But B, a lot of them are union members. And so they have let's say,
mm.
a strong labor identity that gives them a sense of worth. I may hold all kinds of objectionable beliefs, but at the end of the day, I'm a working person. I'm a union
Right,
member, and
right.
that matters to me most. And that's what I'm going to go to the voting booth with as my primary identity. Unions get decimated in the 80s. Labor identity erodes as a sort of meaningful point of reference. Those nationalist beliefs that were there before all of a sudden become more salient as the context gets more threatful and uncertain, and as the political elites keep feeding
Sure.
you,
Right.
a set of narratives that activate your nationalist beliefs. And so, to come back to your earlier question, where social media comes in is just turning up the volume and the speed on all this,
Yeah.
right? You're
Right.
now hearing not just from politicians that things are bad and you should blame these folks over here. You're hearing that from a whole bunch of people you're interacting with online, whether it's on
Yeah.
X or on some other platform. You don't have to, and there isn't as much of a kind of nightly news anchoring everyone's reality in the same
Right.
place,
We're not
right?
operating from a shared base of
That's
information.
right.
Yeah,
That's right.
that's
So I
right.
think that in the absence of social media, it's likely that what we're seeing would have still been unfolding, but maybe more slowly, maybe more in fits and starts, where it was, I think, with the accelerant of social media and the kind of epistemological unmooredness, right? That
Mm.
nobody knows what to believe. And AI doesn't
Right.
help, by the
Can't trust
way,
anything. Yeah, and
right?
AI is not helping. That's right.
Yeah. So all of a
Right.
sudden, we all are sort of coming at politics from very different places, cognitively, in terms of our identities and beliefs.
I remember once upon a time I had this like totally naive belief that because I came up in the internet of the 90s that my kids would sort of would have this very like granular, obscure taste in like Kurdish techno, right? Or like whatever the fuck, just like weird stuff from the very edges of the internet, because that was sort of the internet of my young adult life was you get to sort of like cultivate these tastes in really specific stuff. And it's so interesting that like I'm just thinking of like the analogy to politics is so interesting here, because like once upon a time you would have expected that people who had endless access to endless information online would wind up with these really sort of diverse in each person, diverse
Yeah.
political tastes. Like, I'm really into guns, but I also believe people should have the right to have an abortion if they want to. And
Right.
I'm, fine with trans people and blah, blah, blah. And instead, in the same way that my kids are listening to the same stuff as everybody does, and I go to Portugal or anywhere else in the world, and teenagers are wearing exactly the same stuff as they do here because TikTok moves it so fast. I also, you tell me, but like, is it? I remember reading somewhere that people are far more like homogenous
Yes.
across issues. If you're a Republican, you can pretty much predict what they're going to be feeling about all these different issues, and if you're a Democrat, you can predict that. Is that true? Like, people
Yeah.
they don't have individual tastes anymore politically.
That's right. It's we're basically in a world of pretty drastic polarization where your issue beliefs line up with your partisan identity, but so do your cultural tastes, right? It's what
Ugh.
sociologist Daniel Del Posta calls this the oil spill model of polarization, where essentially everything
Hmm.
starts spilling into these two buckets. And whether you're a latte drinking liberal or a truck driving Republican, right? Like these are all of a sudden these markers of cultural taste become aligned with your issue positions, become aligned with your partisan identity, with less and less cross-cutting preferences, beliefs, and identities. So that
God, that
makes compromise
sucks.
really difficult. It does. It is, and it's really unfortunate. Um, I've shown in my past work actually that this is actually that nationalists has followed the same trend, and
Hmm.
um, in the 90s even, not that long ago, you couldn't really predict somebody's partisan identity based on what they thought America meant, actually. And vice versa,
Hmm.
you couldn't predict what they thought America meant based on our partisan identity. By the early 2000s, these things are totally aligned, or not totally,
Whoa.
but increasingly aligned, so that um, partisanship and nationalist beliefs start aligning. That is, nationalism gets sorted by party. And this is actually
Wow.
one of the big factors, in my view, in explaining what's happening in terms of Trump support, is that Republicans have become predominantly what I call restrictive nationalists or ardent nationalists, essentially exclusionary and populist.
Hmm.
Democrats have shifted in the other direction. But among Republicans, basically, this suggests to me, this really started in the early 2000s and has been ramping up ever since. But it suggests to me that actually the demand for a Trump-like figure had been there way before Trump came on the scene, which is why
Hmm.
we saw Sarah Palin try, partly succeed, ultimately fail. It's why we saw the Tea Party, right, take off unbelievably strongly among
Yeah.
the Republicans and actually reconfigure the entire kind of congressional Republican membership.
Sure.
And that those were early signs of a desire, a demand for a Trump-like figure that Trump really skillfully dialed into when he campaigned. Again, not by some grand strategy, but kind of throwing the spaghetti against the wall, seeing what stuck, and then sticking to that. And so, the fact that not just whether you drink a latte or not, whether you drive a Tesla, although that's interesting, changed or not, but also what you think America means is now profoundly indicative of which party you vote for.
Hmm. Hmm. That's so interesting. Do, does the do you find yourself? I mean, well, I have so many questions. So let's break down our terms for a second here, because I want to, before we go further in talking about nationalism, populism, and the rest of it, explain that to me. Because before I met you at Casbus, I thought those terms were kind of interchangeable. Like, I didn't really understand the distinction between those. So let's define our terms a little bit. Tell me about nationalism, which you studied early on, and then populism as we're seeing it now, and then, of course, authoritarianism.
Sure. Nationalism means many things to many people, so I'll just tell you my take on it. It's kind of what I've been articulating through our conversation, and that is the way I think about nationalism is these are ideas, beliefs that people hold about what the nation means to them. and which are composed of all kinds of different dimensions. So, who gets to be a legitimate member of the nation? What's the relationship between the state and the nation? Should we be proud of the state? Should we be fearful of the state? It's also about, the place of the nation in the global community. Are we the greatest nation on earth? Is American projection of power about kind of being the policeman of the world or a humanitarian force? All of these kind of global comparisons of the nation. So all of these things.
So when somebody, just so organized, so when somebody throws a modifier on the front of that in naming somebody or a group, Christian nationalist, white nationalist, generally speaking, should we understand that to mean that person's sense of nationalism
Yeah.
is based in being white, based in being Christian?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
So
Okay.
all these modifiers are really about pinning down which kind of nationalism are we talking about, which kind of belief system about the nation this person might hold, or their community might hold, or the politicians that they support might hold. And so, Christian nationalism is really about prioritizing Christian beliefs in as a criterion of legitimate belonging.
Right.
White nationalism about whiteness. But then there's all these other dimensions to this, which is, are America's best times behind it in history? Should we reclaim those, or are we sort of moving forward to a better, brighter future? That's also about, where the nation sits in time. Is America the greatest nation in the world, or are we just, we're just a good nation like many others, right? Or the very notion of actually adding normative claims to kind of nationhood. So all of these things are different components of these kind of cultural models we hold of our own country. Many people hold multiple models, right? You can be American, you can be also of another ancestry, another national identity, and you hold these kind of different configurations of beliefs about America and another nation concurrently. And so when I think about nationalism, it's really about understanding how these configurations of beliefs about the nation vary within countries, and when do they become politically activated. And so I've alluded to these kind of different types of nationalism, and some of them are more prominent among Republicans, some among Democrats, and increasingly our elections are about which type of nationalism shall reign supreme, right? Which America should our country represent, and which America should we be striving for in the future? That's the nationalism part. And again, these are beliefs held among the population, but also these are narratives articulated by politicians, by the media, in trying to appeal to the public.
Right. Okay. So that's nationalism.
That's nationalism.
Populism.
Populism is often used as a catch-all for this entire kind of family of political parties. Radical right becomes equated with populism, but actually, populism is not an inherently right-wing phenomenon. It actually emerged out of the left in the late 19th century in the United States, but you see it on the left and the right all over the world. What really is at the heart of populism is kind of a moral dichotomy between some sort of a vilified elite that is corrupt, that has lost its way, that does not represent us, the people. So the other half of that dichotomy are the people. And the idea is that the people are inherently good, the elites are inherently and irrevocably corrupt. And the only way to restore balance to our polity is to kick out the elites and replace them with the people's direct representatives, right? So the idea is that people should regain power and kick out the corrupt elites. And again, this can exist on the left and the right, and part of the way that works is depends which is the vilified elite. So on the left, the vilified elites tend to be, big business, Wall Street fat cats, corporate elites. On the right, the vilification is typically targeting bureaucrats, elected politicians,
academics,
intellectuals, union leaders,
art,
etc. Right? Yeah, of course.
Right.
And so, but you can imagine having a similar argument. In some ways, Bernie Sanders represents kind of a populist left in the United States. It's a pretty mild populist left by global standards, but within the U.S. context, it seems quite radical. The idea that there's a lot of inequality in the United States, and those who are at the top economically are the ones who are feeding off of everyone else.
What a bomb chucker! That's crazy. Right.
And I think in most European countries that would just be called social democracy.
Yeah, it'd be called waking up and reading the paper.
Yeah, that's right. And there are actual left populists in Europe, for instance, who are much more radical than Sanders, of course. But anyway, the point is that you can have this kind of discursive formation of kind of anti-elite, pro-people moral binary, this kind of dichotomy, either left or the right. But in radical politics, radical right politics, it is often fused together with an ethno-nationalism, with an exclusionary nationalism. So it's about restoring the nation's greatness because the elites have abandoned the nation. And part of the restoring of the nation's greatness is returning it to its legitimate owners,
Yeah,
so to
right.
speak, right? Its
Right.
legitimate citizens who are not immigrants, who are not minorities, and so forth. So that's where populism and nationalism come together. The third concept I think you were alluding to is authoritarianism, which is really, it's a slightly different thing. It's really a mode of governance that undermines liberal democratic norms and institutions.
Hmm.
So everything from disregarding court orders, using the military to squash protest,
Right. Right.
undermining universities as potential loci of resistance, and
Yeah,
so
and
forth. Right?
showing no embarrassment about it, right? It's like
No embarrassment.
it's not a bug, it's a feature. It's a
It
thing
is
to
a
be
feature.
excited about.
That's
Yeah.
right. Because it's
Yeah.
sticking it to the man, right? So this is where it comes
Right.
together with populism and nationalism, right? The elites are in charge. Authoritarianism gives us a set of tools for resisting the hegemony of the elites, right? And the elites, where are they? They're in universities, they're in
Yeah.
Washington, they're in the media, right? All of the above. They're in the courts quite often as well. And so, how do you get rid of them? Well, it's really difficult because they have all kinds of protections, right? But if you use authoritarian tools, you don't care
Mhm.
about those protections. You don't care about the law. You don't care about using state power in your own advantage. And so the way this is sold to the supporters is that, again, coming back to the previous terms, you don't like where your nation is heading. People like you are starting to lose. Who's gaining? Immigrants and minorities. Who's to blame? Elites. How do we
Mhm.
fix it? Elect me. I'll
Give me the
use
reins.
authoritarian tools
Yeah.
to get your country back. And
Right,
this is,
right,
I
right.
mean, exactly what we're seeing. It's basically the same playbook. And we're seeing it with Trump, but we've seen it, as you pointed out earlier, we've seen it in Hungary with Orban. We've seen it in Brazil
Yeah.
with Bolsonaro. We've seen this in Poland with Kaczynski, in India with Modi, and on and on and on.
Yeah.
And so the playbook is well understood, diffused across the world, and even the mobilization strategies are quite similar as we talked about earlier.
When we come back, we're gonna take a tour of the world that Bart is describing and understand a little bit more about what these commonalities are and what's happening in countries other than the US. Stay with us. You were born in Poland. So as I don't know anywhere near as much as you do about politics in the EU, but as I understand it, Poland for a long time has been a kind of like rock solid, easygoing member of the EU, just a great, breadbasket and manufacturing hub and all that stuff. And you didn't give them a lot of political trouble. And now, I mean, this is what part of why I reached out to you. Carol, I don't know even how to say his name,
Nawrocki.
Nawrocki has now won, and he's the classic. He's a nationalist historian, podcaster kind of guy, boxer, give me the reins kind of person. I mean, it's amazing to me. For you, is there any personal resonance here for you? I mean, being born in Poland, does this shock you? Does it jive for you? How do you
Yeah,
react to
it
it?
certainly resonates, and it's deeply worrisome for all the reasons you just mentioned. Poland, obviously, very difficult, long history, a complicated place, but it had this moment of liberation in 1990, post-communist period, and then really coming to Europe in the
Mm.
early 2000s, where it became an integral member of the European Union, and not only that, but a very successful one.
Yeah.
During the Eurozone crisis, Poland did just fine. It was one of the few
This
countries
is the thing, right?
this
This is
right
not a
in
place in crisis, in
no,
economic crisis.
no,
Right.
no, but nonetheless, the similar ingredients as the ones we've talked about in the United States were present there,
Mm.
um, with some differences, right? So one of the differences is sort of a post-communist disappointment with a
Mm.
neoliberal reality, right?
Mm.
So the idea was, hey, we're liberated from communism, everyone's going to succeed now. But what they actually got is US style neoliberalism. And it turns out
Uh,
neoliberalism is a tough thing. Not everybody wins, right? And
that's so interesting. So I had another one of our fellows on the other day, Tuomas Ilves, the former
right,
president of Estonia, and Estonia is a country that, by and large, I mean, it's only 1.3 million people or something. It's a very small country, but like they really saw benefits, right?
yes,
They got this digital neoliberal, cocktail that was delicious. It turns out
sure.
for the vast majority of that country, at least as far as we can tell. But that didn't sound, that's not how it
Well,
works out in Poland.
different countries, different in the sense of different population sizes, different rural urban breakdowns.
Yeah.
The Poland, in some ways, actually similar to the United States in the microcosm, in the sense that yeah, the neoliberal cocktail had all kinds of delicious ingredients.
Mm,
Poland in the 80s was gray and poor and economically flat,
right. Right.
largely, except for
Right.
a few fat cats who were part of the Communist Party. Um,
Hmm.
Poland in the late 90s, early 2000s is like Western Europe. It's colorful, it's beautiful, it's
Yeah.
increasingly diverse. It's wealthy, but unequal.
Mm.
So that's one ingredient. And I think for some, those who didn't win, and because again, not everyone wins in neoliberalism, the disappointment was profound. You
Mm.
promised us all this, but instead we got poverty and inequality. So that's
I
one ingredient.
wonder, and I wonder if that's somehow more disappointing to
I think so.
generations of people who were held flat, stagnant under Soviet rule.
That's right. Under Soviet rule, everybody lost, right, in some ways.
Yeah.
So, and it
Right.
doesn't matter if you were a doctor or if you were, a janitor. Your status was, I mean, maybe your symbolic status was different, but your income wasn't all that different.
Yeah. Right.
Whereas I think, quite clearly under a capitalist system that changed profoundly. That's one difference between Poland. I mean, there are many differences, but one significant difference. Another one is a new democracy in some ways in the 1990s, right? So a lot of partisan turnover. Few parties remain in power for more than one term. And a lot of parties proliferate. So this is a new democratic system. People are kind of becoming politically active, and that leads to a lot of instability. So those are two big differences which have significance down the line. But the similarities with the US and other countries is, again, a politics of status threat and politics of disappointment and
Mm.
grievance, right? The idea that as Poland's becoming Western, as Poland's becoming diverse, as Poland's becoming progressive and liberal and infused with all the values of the European Union, that works for many, but it doesn't work for everyone. It doesn't work
Mm.
for the fundamentally Catholic, more rural,
Mm.
less wealthy parts of the population.
Right. Very
And
similar to the United States in
very
that way.
similar. And they're
Sure.
frustrated. Warsaw's doing great.
Right.
Krakow's doing
The
great.
elites.
Wrocław,
Right.
Łódź, they're doing great. The elites are doing
Right.
great, but the
Right.
elites, I'm not the elite, and the elite again are screwing me,
Mm.
right? And
Mm.
so all of
Mm.
a sudden you've got a grievance, and mixed with that is Poland is a really deeply there are really deeply religious segments of the population. I don't want to say it's a
Mm.
religious country because that's not true, but
Right. Right.
there are the Catholic factions in Poland are really strong. They're very traditional, and
Mm.
so Western values, quote unquote, having to do with gender equality, with LGBTQ rights, et cetera, has the same kind of abrasive
Yeah.
impact
Right.
on these folks as you see in other places. So economic stagnation, inequality, et cetera, mixed with cultural change and with this kind of political instability, this kind of lots of turnover in politics, all of that again creates the same sort of seeds for a radical right takeover.
Yeah.
And what's interesting here is, despite its growing diversity, Poland is still a shockingly homogenous country. It wasn't
Yeah.
always. It wasn't before World War
Right.
One, and certainly and interwar years. But post World War II Poland, very homogenous. So
Yeah.
who do you blame?
Yeah.
Right.
I was just going to say, well, who are we upset at? But
Well,
I assume they have some immigration.
right. So who
Yeah.
are you upset at? Well, you're certainly upset at the elites, the liberals and progressives who are anti-Polish and in cahoots with Brussels.
Sure.
But you're also upset at the Jews, except there
Mhm.
are not really any Jews in Poland. So you're really
What a
fearful of the
dark
idea
thing
of
to be
Jews, right?
yeah, to even get into that.
Right. So this is
Just
all
for
the
Polish
Polish
history.
anti-Semitism has been there for decades, for
Right.
centuries. It sort of ebbs and flows, comes and goes in its intensity. But all of a sudden, when things are getting dicey, you turn to your kind of sure enemies, right? So anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, even though there were really no Muslims in Poland, Russophobia and Germanophobia. So fear of the old enemies across the two borders.
Right.
Right. So basically, it really doesn't matter who you vilify.
That's what's so crazy.
Right.
You can really
present.
find this in anyone.
Right.
If you're like, I was just thinking, if extraterrestrials landed on the planet and looked at that cocktail, they'd be like, that mix of people, they'd be like, well,
Right.
but wait a minute, you guys are like genetically identical. Like, what are you upset about? And then you could say, it turns out you can apply what you've studied all your career to any tiny little difference between people,
That's
and
right.
it seems to work politically.
That's right. And in some cases, you can mobilize phantom fears. Like this Islamophobia, anti-Semitism in Poland is really a phantom fear. It's a
Yeah.
fear of people on the outside who might come back any minute, might come any
Right.
minute. The fear of Germany and Russia. I mean, Russia may be a little more realistic these days, for sure.
Yeah, sure.
Germany. I mean, there was all this consternation in Poland, but Germans coming back to reclaim territory in southwest Poland. And what's going to happen? We're going to have another invasion. So again, they're using the same kind of mechanisms to identify, to vilify certain
Yeah.
populations, certain countries, to instill fear, to galvanize support around grievances that they bundle together into an overall kind of set of problems that they diagnose and then have prescriptions for, which are elect us
Right.
and will restore your country. So what that led to, with also, by the way, a precipitating event where basically half of the government perished in an airplane
That's
crash.
right. Oh, I forgot about that.
That's right, and
Right.
that was a source of all kinds of conspiracies. But that plane crash killed one of the two twins who were the leaders of the radical right party. So you imagine how that fuels
Mm,
further conspiracies and
right.
support for the party. All that to
Right.
say is the Law and Justice, the Peace Party, Prawo i Sprawiedliwość, they get into power. They stay in power for a while. They do the same things you see in Turkey and Hungary, in the United States now, the same playbook of eroding institutions, liberal democratic institutions, little by little. The
Hmm.
media, universities, the courts, the same stuff.
Hmm. Sowing
Um,
doubt in all of these institutions.
Sowing that, but fundamentally undermining their legitimacy and
Hmm.
their autonomy,
Hmm.
which is what we're seeing in the United States. Amazingly, in the last parliamentary election, polls turn out in mass numbers, like just
Hmm.
unprecedented voter turnout, 90% and plus in some
Mhm.
cities. In Warsaw, I believe, was really, really high. And they, in the 11th hour, kick out the radical right party before it manages to destroy democracy altogether. And everybody takes this as good news, right? Look at this. We had a radical right party in power. We've gotten rid of them. Democracy is back, right? So they basically, in the last moment, kicked out the radicals.
Yeah.
Now, of course, just like Biden in 2020, right? This is this euphoria of like, we won,
Right.
is totally understandable, but sadly a little short-sighted, because again, like Trump too, what you referred to, the presidential election in Poland in the recent weeks, when the mainstream parties, in this case center-right party in the US was the Democratic Party, regains power from the radical right, the expectations are so high that it's going to fix everything that was
Right.
broken by the radicals before and restore a sense of normalcy, take care of all the problems that were at the root of the rise of the radical right. And of course, they cannot do that. They cannot do that for two reasons. One, it's hard generally.
Yeah.
But two, a lot of the levers of policymaking that would normally be available to them have been already undermined by the radical right in the first in their first round at the table.
Right. Right.
And so that breeds disappointment, and it breeds a return to the radical right in subsequent elections. And this is exactly what happened with Trump. This is, by the way, what happened with Orban. Orban lost, came back with a vengeance, and then continued the work that he had started in his prior term.
Right.
So in this case, we're talking about a presidential election. It's not the same as a parliamentary election in Poland, but it's a significant one because it's another setback. Much as in the United States, there was this period of 4 years where Democrats were in power to some degree, and it looked like the tide was turning, only to revert back. And when the radical right comes back, it comes back with a vengeance.
And do you think, as many observers have argued, that Poland is sort of, is that the clearest sign we've had yet that this is truly a tide, that populism is really, is gathering force? This is that we're not at the apex yet?
Well, I think we see it in many countries in different forms. So the fact that Hungary is basically, for the time being, a formerly liberal democracy, that's been essentially dismantled by Viktor Orban, like that's a pretty good sign. That doesn't seem to be going away. That's sort of a continuum. Same thing in Turkey under Erdogan, in India under Modi. So there are all these cases where the radical right's in power and they're not leaving. That's one pathway. Another sign of what you're describing is this sort of pattern in Poland and the United States, where the radical right comes into power, leaves, comes back with a vengeance.
Yeah.
But then there's the other pattern, which is typical in Western Europe, is that they're always there. They're mainstream. They're part of the electoral system.
Right.
And they don't necessarily win power because of the way that political institutions are set up in Western Europe, but they're always
They're
a
part of the
threat.
parliament.
And they're
Yeah.
part of ruling coalitions quite often,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And they almost squeak in every time. Eventually, they probably will have a parliamentary majority at some point. I
Hmm.
imagine. But there's sort of in all of these cases, whether it's cases where the radical right is in power long term, the ones where it sort of boomerangs back, or the ones where it's always around the margins, kind of influencing things. The bottom line is they are now part of the political reality in all of these countries. They're not going away. They're part of the mainstream. And in some ways, it leads to a bit of an asymmetric political warfare because traditional centrist parties don't have the same weaponry
Yeah.
as the radical right. And so these kind of processes of the left winning, the right winning, the left winning, the right winning, what's called thermostatic politics, have always been around in democracies. But they're typically, those contests were fought in good faith between two sides that disagree about policy, but they don't necessarily disagree about the very institutions of democracy.
Right.
Right? Whereas now the struggle is between some parties that believe in liberal democracy and some parties who fundamentally either don't care about liberal democracy or actively want to destroy it. And so when the oscillation is between these two sides, the outcome is very different. It's
Yeah.
basically a gradual descent into authoritarianism, which it's not clear we can actually stop.
When we come back in our final segment, we're going to talk about whether we can stop the slide that Bart has studied all this time and whether these people really believe this stuff or whether it's all performance. We'll be right back. Let's talk about some possible solutions here. You did research in 2022. You put out a paper called "Measuring Populism, Nationalism, and Authoritarianism in U.S. Presidential Campaigns," and it makes me want to ask this question about, I've been thinking about, Trump will die at some point because all humans do, and I'm not even fully convinced he's going to last the term. This is a deeply unhealthy guy based on everything that everyone has said about how he conducts his life. So I found myself thinking, like, I don't see anybody in the wings that seems to have the kind of psychotic hold on on his base the way Trump has. Like, all these people around him seem like, small potatoes compared to whatever he's serving. I think because he's just such a sort of narcissistic figure. He's a very specific psychological person, it seems to me. So I have a couple questions for you. First of all, do you think, like, once he goes away, does this go away, this moment that we're in, or do you see anybody in the wings that could actually step into the same role? And then the second thing is, you've studied this paper that I mentioned, which is you used neural language modeling to track these sort of ideological trends. Have you seen in past episodes in American history places where rhetoric and ideology was effective in pushing back against what Trump has been selling? So let's start with this thing first about Trump.
Yeah.
When he goes away, does this go away, or do you see people that can step in and play the same kind of role?
Yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right that Trump is in some ways a unique actor in American politics. And in some ways it's his dark genius that he is
Yeah.
able to galvanize support and really dial into the grievances of his supporters in such a profound way. And it's obviously deeply problematic and odious, but it is amazing also at just how good he is at what he does. And I think, most people on the left fundamentally underestimated him from the get-go. I remember I did too, like at the Washington Correspondents' Dinner when Obama was insulting him, everybody was laughing and nobody thought for a second that this guy, that's a moment probably where he's like, you know what, I'm going to have my revenge. And he succeeded. So there is something about him that is sort of sui generis. So yes, I don't know who else in the Republican Party is ready to step in his absence and who would be able to fulfill the same role.
I don't see it, right? I look at Vance, who clearly will say anything to get in front of a microphone. And people, I think, sense that
That's
politically
right.
on some level. He just
That's right.
doesn't inhabit that character very well. I look at the Josh Hawleys and those guys, and they just don't feel, they don't feel like they method act the
That's right.
way that you have
That's
to
right.
be a Trump guy. So
That's right.
to be
Because
Trump. I don't know.
Trump is in his moral emptiness. He's real, right? He's not faking it. I mean, he's faking all the ideological stuff because he doesn't care about any of that. But the characterological features are really there, right?
So draw
It's
that line for me so I understand how you think about it. So
I mean, in the sense, I just don't think until recently, maybe now he does, but until some time ago, he didn't have, I don't think, any actual policy beliefs. He doesn't care about
right.
policy. He cares about power. He
This
cares
explains
about
why once upon a time he didn't care. He had a lot of racist public stuff, but he otherwise was pretty liberal about,
yeah, he was a Democrat.
abortion or whatever. He's a New Yorker,
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
But he always had this chip on his shoulder about not being fully included and, et
Mm,
cetera. But I think his modus operandi is dominance, right?
mm.
He is not loyal to anyone. He has a need for dominance and for unlimited power, and he's willing to do anything to get it,
Yep.
including come up with all kinds of policy proposals he doesn't care about. So,
Yeah.
but nobody cares about them among the vote. I shouldn't say that. Voters care about policies, but they care much more about identity and kind of connection,
The feeling of the
and
guy.
being heard and hearing the right kind
Yeah.
of grievances articulated. So I think he's quite unique in that. But I will say, although I don't see anyone fulfilling that role, it's hard to anticipate these things. And
Yeah, right,
in
right.
most other
What do I know?
countries,
If the last few years have taught me anything, what
right.
do I know? Yeah.
I mean, certainly we don't know who's going to come out of the woodwork. In other
Right.
countries, we've seen successors who've been pretty good at what they do. I mean, Maloney in Italy wasn't the obvious person you would have picked to be sort of playing that role, 10 years ago, but here she is. So one thing is exactly that, the unanticipated characters that might come up. But the other thing is, even if there is no Trump 2, the damage will have been done, and the
Mm,
Republican Party will have been radicalized, profoundly radicalized.
mm,
So if Trump goes away, the Republican Party has now handed an institutional configuration, a system that they can use to their advantage for the
right.
same ends as Trump uses them. And
Right, if
so,
anything, somebody will come along who recognizes that the choreography works, knows how to plant a seed in that ground. I
sure.
mean, essentially, I think about like who's this far right guy in Romania who came out of
Yeah.
nowhere? He's like some random agronomist,
And
right?
there are going to be others like that.
Yeah,
But
right,
also, it's
right.
not even about individuals, because I think you need a charismatic individual to capture the party in the first place, like Trump did. But
Hmm,
once the party is captured, and once the party realizes that this formula works, and once the party has tilted the playing field entirely in its advantage by reconfiguring the institutions,
sure.
possibly you don't actually need the charismatic leader afterwards. You may
Hmm,
just need rank and file or radical Republicans who are going to take advantage of the situation and of the institutions that are serving them to continue pursuing this path going forward.
yeah.
You still need, you need competent politicians to get elected, of course,
But
but
only
you know,
they only really need to get dressed and like to be in front of a mic. That
yeah.
really is it, man. But Bart, you are bumming me out with that. That is too bad.
I apologize.
So that, I mean, it's good to know though. So considering that you've looked at political ideology since the 50s and seen kind of how it's changed in campaigns over time, do you have any advice for people who are saying who will have to run against this? If an AOC goes for it, or I don't know, first, yeah, like what kind of person, what kind of ideology do you think is sort of going to be politically effective against this in the future? And what kind of things do you think they should say?
So I think it's a very difficult question,
Yeah.
because
I'm putting a lot on you with this
no,
one.
no, it's fine, but it's not the first time. It's just it's hard to have definitive answers. Let's put it that way. I
Yeah.
think solely running on an anti-Trump campaign is not enough. I think you
Yeah.
need to have a forward-looking vision that gives all voters, and a good chunk of Trump voters, a sense of worth and a sense of hope for themselves and their families. So kind of
Mhm.
a economic populist framework, maybe a Sanders-like, AOC-like approach. That is one important element. Promising good governance and kind of the nuts and bolts, of infrastructure, of the thing of the things that we use every day in our daily lives that are crumbling around us is probably part of it too. But I think the other thing, unfortunately, is you need to have a vision for the nation and a way of articulating what the nation is all about that is capacious enough to include immigrants, minorities, all Americans, but also some of those white Americans who feel disaffected. And
Yeah.
there is a precedent, and we don't have to go back to the 50s. Think about Barack Obama. He
Mm,
was in some ways a unique position to be able to really key into support from Black voters, from Latino voters, et cetera. But he was also able to persuade white voters by having
mm,
kind of a broad sense of what America is. And you know, he was really masterful at this.
yeah. Right.
Um, you know, in power, he was constrained in many ways, and you know, and not everything was a success for obvious reasons. But that kind of way of articulating an inclusive identity, American identity, inclusive vision for the nation, that also has a concrete vision for people's future, the future of them and their families, I think would work. I actually think, frankly, that Biden's first campaign and Kamala Harris's campaign were not bad on both fronts. Unfortunately, the timing was not right, and you know, in some ways, there
Yeah.
was an anti-incumbent backlash in the midst of fears about inflation, and we like to blame the candidate, but actually, you know, and especially Democrats love to do a circular firing squad and say, "Oh, what did we do this time? You know, we
Yeah.
failed
Right. Right.
miserably."
Right.
What if you did everything right, or at least most things right, but the timing was wrong, right? So I actually
I
think
mean,
they're not
right.
far off.
Well, and this is the thing is you're I feel like the what you're describing to me makes perfect sense. You should be able to articulate to people, hey, your lives will improve, your, the infrastructure that holds us all up will be improved. And I have this generous, you know, I have a space in my heart for everyone. And I can see the appeal of that. On the other hand, I feel like at least two of those three things, you're
Right,
writing a check that you got to be able to cash.
of course.
And the problem even now is that even when you do manage to come through on that check, people just don't feel
Yeah,
like they've been benefited, even when they have,
I agree.
and there's something I don't know what to do about that.
That's very tricky, and I mean, to some degree, it is partly about Democrats not being very good at
Yeah, no.
communicating what they do
Right.
to the public.
Right.
I think most voters did not know what the Biden administration had accomplished.
No,
Arguably one
that's
of the
right.
most economically progressive administrations in recent memory. Most voters have no idea, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So I think there's a communication aspect to this.
It
Yeah,
reminds me of journalists who also are terrible at explaining what they do and how they do it, what their
right,
guidelines are, what their ethics are, how they get, to the bottom of a thing. And I think it's because this country has put so much emphasis on the idea that a sort of, free and objective, a free press is a sort of bedrock of, and as a result, you as a journalist aren't trained to explain what you do and
that's right.
explain why it's valuable. And I
Same
feel
with
like even
academics.
I feel well, that's right. That's true of academics. And I feel like that's been true for progressive politicians for a long time. It's just like you're just not used to uh, having to explain why your ideas are correct. You've just been brought up to believe they're correct all of this time. Whereas the other side, I mean, the problem that we have, and you made this point earlier, is that it used to be that we would duke it out over policy.
Right,
And now, not only you have a subset of people who maybe don't even feel that we should be living in a democracy anymore, and I see that as often in tech as I do in political circles. But you also, I feel like, have people who are not um, uh, who don't care about anything but winning.
yeah,
Right? This is the
at all costs.
classic at all costs. There is no, any, West Wing, I grew up with the West Wing where you sort of think, oh, a handshake at the end between, fierce intellectual rivals because they've come together over something that everyone feels is correct. That would be like a political death sentence
Yeah,
for people on the right today.
that's right. That's
And
right.
so I don't know. I don't know what we do
Yeah,
in that.
and as you pointed out, that like write checks that you can cash, and the idea that let's say Democrats win in the midterms, which is possible,
Mhm.
or Democrat wins the next presidential election, right? You have only 4 years to deliver on all those promises
That's
while
right.
trying to repair the just unbelievable damage that's been done to our core institutions. What, in 4 months, five
That's right.
months?
That's right.
right?
That's
So far, and there's another bunch of months to come of further damage. So it's a really tall order. This is what I was talking about earlier with Poland, to repair while moving forward and building.
right.
And
Right.
doing it
Repair
in
the
a
plane
short
while
enough
flying it.
time, they don't get
Yep.
kicked out again and replaced with the same people all over again. So
Hmm.
it's a
Hmm.
really dire, I think, situation in the longer term. But every time I see protest, every time I see Americans standing up for what we should all believe in, I'm heartened.
Yeah, that's
But
right.
I try not to make projections into the future because I've been wrong too many times, and
Yeah.
it's also pretty dismal looking forward.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. Well, Bart, it's been this is so it's always it's tough stuff. We're doing good work on tough adult conversations. I really appreciate you being here. Thank you so much for doing this.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
The Rip Current is produced and created by me, Jacob Ward. And if you liked this show and you want more content like this, go to theripcurrent.com, where I publish a weekly newsletter that covers these same sorts of stories of the big invisible forces that have us all in their grip. And if you want to really do me a favor, if you could go to where you have listened to this or watched it and like it, share it, or even better, review it. Holy cow, is that helpful? It's the best possible way for me to find a new audience. I really appreciate you being here. Thanks for listening.